Hello, my name is McAloon. I am here today as member of the Calf Care Technical Working Group, and I just want to review some of the key points pertinent to weaning for the coming spring. So although this is an age-old area, there's lots of new research coming on stream in this area, and we've heard in previous discussions about feed rates and so on, and I think it's just important, I suppose, to start by reviewing the fact that a calf, when they're born, is very much what we call a monogastric, so very similar type of digestion to a human or a dog, for example, and it's really only at 4 to 6 weeks really where this transitional phase where the rumen starts to develop, and from there forward through to weaning where we try to really promote that rumen development and have a successful working weaning rumen at the point of weaning. I think that's super important because in the early phase a calf is really designed to grow on milk. We should be giving them plenty of milk and getting that growth and out of them. However, we have to have a trade-off between growing them on milk and getting them to eat some concentrate to get them to weaning. So if a calf was left to suckle naturally on a suckler cow, for example, their voluntary feed intake would be close to around 20% of body weight. Traditionally, very historically, we used to feed calves 10% of body weight, and we realised that was strictly underfeeding them. So a compromise now, an industry standard, is around 15% of body weight. So as you've heard, depending on, say, for a 40 kilo calf, about 6 litres of milk fed in 2 feeds up till they're about 4 weeks of age, and then we can start adjusting that accordingly. So starter intake is the key message here really, because starter intake is what drives weaning, drives development of that rumen, which is tiny at birth, and by the time the calf hits 4, 5, 6 weeks of age, that rumen is developing. So it's the fermentation and processing of starter to volatile fatty acids that drives the development of the rumen wall, and that's really key. So we want to be offering starter from the first week of life, even though calves will only probably play with it in that stage, but they certainly should be getting used to it and accustomed to it. So fresh starter offered from early on. And another key point about starter intake is for the rumen to ferment the starter to get the useful end products, the calf really needs access to fresh water. So fresh water and starter should be offered from the first week of life. And then obviously as we start to drop back milk from that transitional phase onward, the calf then should be taking in much more starter. So as we drop back milk, then the calf has to meet their nutrient requirements. So hopefully their starter intake will increase, gradually onwards from about that 6-week mark. And I suppose we do talk about targets in terms of weight and age and so on, and they are useful to direct the logistics and how we plan weaning. But really the key piece of information is that starter intake should be the proxy measure of a functional rumen, and it should be that we're using to decide on acceptable time to wean our calves. So we talk about a minimum of 1 kilo of concentrate, but I would probably go further and say that ideally in group fed calves they would be eating 1.5 kilos of concentrate consistently over 3 or 4 consecutive days before we could say, right, those calves look like that they're good to go. The other thing about the milk feeding, if we're feeding 15% of body weight in around that 6 litres from birth, by 4 to 6 weeks of age, if we're still feeding 6 litres of milk, then that calf is getting bigger, and we're gradually stepping down the milk feed. So I suppose no matter how we do it, whether we drop to once a day feeding from about that 4 to 6 week mark onward, or whether we drop, then we probably would go further and start dropping volume in the run into weaning, that whenever we decide to wean our calves, the key is that we would try and do it gradually, so that it's a gradual transition. So we're dropping back the milk over sort of a 7 to 14 day period, and we're ensuring that starter intake is increasing to that, ideally 1.5 kilos. So in addition to starter and water, forage is also important. So important to provide fresh forage to the calves, straw ideally fed from a rack and possibly also hay. I think it's important though that we do remember that the key point is the starter intake, and forage will help increase starter intake and help develop the actual physical size of the rumen. So they should have access to it as well. So that's the key points, I think, in terms of the weaning piece. We also want to be careful that we don't have weaning coinciding with any other stressful event. And ideally we would be measuring our growth rates on farm, so that calves, we're monitoring are our calves actually achieving 0.7, 0.8 kilos of average daily gain per day between birth and weaning, and to try and see how our system is working. Summer scour is something just to quickly mention briefly at the end here, and that's just really a key issue for a small number of farms, although it seems to be becoming more prevalent. Summer scour is a rule-out diagnosis, and really important that you do engage with your vet if you do see this scouring calves shortly after going to grass, because we need to rule out common things like coccidiosis and worms and possible issues with copper and so on before we talk about summer scour. And summer scour really is something that needs a bespoke solution to each farm, because it's something that is still very poorly understood. So different solutions for different farms.